Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Heather Pringle about the Northwomen, Untold Stories from the other half of the Viking world. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Heather Pringle is a science writer who specializes in archaeology. She's the author of 4 other books, and her feature articles have appeared in numerous publications, including National Geographic Magazine, Science, Discover, Scientific American, and Archaeology. She joins us to talk about the Northwomen. Heather, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, tell us about what piqued your interest in wanting to study these women who, for some reason, history is basically ignored.
Well, it's interesting because I think most people tend to think of the Vikings as these big, brawny, bearded men, axe slung over their shoulder, swords clinking at their hips, that kind of a thing. I was certainly no exception to that rule. That's how I thought of them. But several years ago, I made a visit to Oslo, and I went to the Viking Ship Museum. And in the Viking Ship Museum, there is this incredible Viking ship. In fact, it's the star attraction, an authentic Viking ship that was towed on to land during the Viking Age and used as a burial chamber for someone very important, and then covered over with a big mound of earth. And when archaeologists arrived on the scene, neighbors were kind of referring to this big earthen mound as a king's mound. It was assumed that a male lord, a king, was buried underneath all that earth in a ship, because ship burials were known as during the Viking Age. So anyway, archaeologists started digging, and sure enough, they found a ship buried underneath the earth, and all kinds of really wonderful treasures inside. I mean, fragments of these beautiful tapestries that once hung in great halls, and beautiful ceremonial carts, all intricately carved, and fabrics, remnants of clothing, fabrics that were imported all the way from Asia, beautiful silks. And so all this kind of very lavish treasure, including a lot of sacrificed animals, about 10 animals, 10 horses rather. So archaeologists also found human remains in the ship. And when forensic people and anatomists started analyzing these human remains, what they discovered was that these were the remains of 2 individuals, but they were women. They weren't men. They were clearly women. And so this burial, which is known as the Oseberg ship burial, is the most lavish grave known in the Viking world known to archaeologists in the Viking world. And it's not the grave of men, it's the grave of women. And I found this really extraordinary because my vision of the Viking world in the Viking Age was this world steeped in testosterone. So I thought, holy smokes, I've been missing a big chunk of the picture here. And that's when I started getting very interested in Viking women.
And I want to talk about some specifics from the book, but give us a brief overview about how the book's organized and what readers are going to find here.
Sure. Yeah, the book is organized both chronologically and also in terms of various roles that women played in the Viking world. So there's a chapter on Viking warriors. There's a chapter on Viking slaves, a chapter on, Viking artisans, weavers, so on. And all these kinds of roles that women played in the Viking world. So that's a major point of organization. But also the book, each chapter begins with a fictional passage. So I wrote a fictional passage because I've been writing about archaeology for 40 years. I love archaeology. I'm fascinated by it, but I know it's not everybody's cup of tea in some sense. And that I needed a way to really kind of bring these extraordinary finds, archaeological finds, to life. So I wrote fictional passages at the beginning of each chapter that are based on archaeological evidence or historical evidence. And so I wrote one of these passages for each chapter to bring the women alive, because these women have been ignored and kind of lost to us. And it seemed really important to me to kind of try to breathe some life into them and make them real human beings for readers.
So what do you think that is? Why have they been ignored for so long?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. First one is that basically the way I like to put it is that the Vikings were masters of the spoken word, not the written word. So they had a writing system of their own, but it was a writing system based on runic symbols, and it was they carved them on wood or sometimes on stone, but it was really a writing system that really worked well with short messages. So think of it as the Vikings were the masters of the tweets. They were really good at these short, kind of pithy messages, but long histories, big books, forget it. They were not interested in doing that whatsoever. So their system of writing really lent itself to these short messages. So we don't really have much in the way of information from the Vikings themselves about the women in their lives. Basically, we don't have much in the way of written messages. We do have what are called the sagas, and the sagas are stories, often very old stories that were passed down in the Viking Age, thought to have been passed down in the Viking Age, and then later, about 200 years after the Viking Age ended, it ended about the late 1000s. So about 200 years after that, Christian male scholars started writing these stories down. Now, they were Scandinavian and Icelandic scholars, but nevertheless, they were men and they were Christian. And so there's a bit of their stories are well known to us today as the sagas, but there's this filter going on. We don't hear them from the Vikings themselves. We don't hear all the stories. So it's a little hard to evaluate how reliable the stories are, And there's a fair amount of fiction threaded into the sagas as well. So the sagas aren't really what one would like to see as 100% reliable record. So that leaves us some, kind of big holes. And other European writers at the time, most of them were men, a lot of them were Christian, and they were really interested in the activities of women, Viking women. And so we don't have much of a written record on the Viking women. So that's been a huge, I would say, pretty huge problem. But archaeology has a lot of female burials, a lot of evidence concerning the lives of women. And another problem that arose that kind of has hindered studies for many years of Viking women was the fact that a lot of male archaeologists thought them, just made an assumption. They thought that Viking women were probably homemakers and mothers. You might think of a 1950s housewife, for example. That was the kind of life that was thought to be the lives of all Viking women, really. So, it was pretty, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, all very important things. I'm not trying to say that they're not important, but, the assumption was that was the total focus of all the women. And so I think what's happened here in recent decades is that a lot of female archaeologists have started coming into the profession, and they're asking new questions, and they are looking for evidence and saying, hey, what are the women doing? Is this really what was going on? And as a result, we're starting to get a new picture about Viking women. Yes.
Your research reveals women that were critical to the Viking culture and critical to their success in their exploration and their conquering other peoples. They, as you point out, were everything from sorceresses to, explorers and power brokers. And just as I look at it, kind of turns everything on its head. And it seems like these women, without them and their contribution, the Vikings would not have been as successful as they were.
Oh, absolutely. That's certainly what I I found as I was going through the research, and I'd find something like, for example, something that a lot of people probably have never given a whole lot of thought to, I know I hadn't, was, the role of women in just equipping the Viking fleets and helping to create the Viking ships that were, launched in these big fleets. And so the work of women was absolutely critical in getting these ships into the water, so to speak. So they wove the sails. So these sails, the sails on a Viking ship were huge. Some of them were the equivalent size of 20 king-size beds pushed together, if you can imagine that. So it takes a lot of work, and we're not talking about just going to the local wool or yarn shop and buying yarn and weaving it industrially. We're talking everything was handmade. The wool had to be hand processed, plucked by hand from the sheep, and then woven, and all kinds of processes going on. Anyway, it would have taken, in order to create one sail for one large Viking warship, it could have taken, and probably did, based on, and we say this because of the replication experiments that have been done. So in other words, archaeologists have found textile experts who know the old ways of working wool and weaving it and so on, to reproduce the making of these sails, much smaller sails, but to make a large sail for a large Viking warship would have taken 10,269 hours of labor, and that's a woman's labor. I mean, it's an incredible amount of time just to make one sail. And most Viking seafarers were smart. They didn't want to go traveling across the North Atlantic with depending on just one sail. So they often carried spare sailcloth with them, enough to make a second sail. So that's more than 20,000 hours of work just to create enough sailcloth to get it, for one Viking vessel. So that just gives you an idea. Women were essential in these enterprises.
And not only that support role, like you just described, but they were leaders in their own right.
Absolutely. They were. So we have accounts of the women acting as advisors and counselors to their husbands. And there's, extraordinary. In some cases, there's the poem Beowulf, for example, which we now have evidence was actually written in Scandinavia. Or composed, I should say, in Scandinavia. It was not written down, but it was composed orally in Scandinavia. Anyway, we have a picture, in a mental picture, that the poet creates of a great hall, of a feast in a great hall, with the king and his war band in the great hall. And the queen actually at one point stands up and she starts giving him advice publicly. And this is not like whispering in his ear kind of thing. She is actually giving him publicly advice about how to plan his succession. And I mean, I find that extraordinary that she was in a position to do that. So we get these hints and clues of what royal women were up to. But as you say, we see all other kinds of leadership roles, including women who were sorceresses. They practiced magic, and the Vikings really believed in magic. We kind of discount it today. I'm not a believer in magic myself, but the Vikings certainly were, and some women were regarded as possessing magical powers. They were thought to be able to control the weather, with their enchantments. They were thought to be able to control the outcome of a major battle. And so this form of magic was called battle magic. It's interesting because in a few historical accounts, we see that some Viking warlords appeared to be married to sorceresses. So, it was, the Viking warlord had a very powerful sorceress as his partner, let's say, in military operations. She would, I would assume, help, sorceresses claim to be able to read the future, to peer into the future and divine the future. She would be able to help, maybe tell them, oh, well, I've seen, that this tactic is not going to work. Let's try something else. So, these women were really critical and pivotal, I would say.
I'm talking with Heather Pringle about the Northwomen, Untold Stories from the other half of the Viking world. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Well, given how important the women were to Viking culture, what does the research tell us about sort of their social standing or sort of the gender equity that existed at that time?
Well, we don't really get a great, I don't think we get a great picture of it. But, I think women certainly, we can rest assured they were strong, there were strong women. In every society there are rebels. This is how I've come to think of it. In every society there are rebels, people that just don't want to, kind of perform traditional roles, be submissive, to the powers that be. They're always rebels. And some of the Viking women were clearly rebels. They clearly rebelled against the more traditional roles that had been assigned to them, mothers and housewives. And again, I'm certainly not saying that those weren't important, but for some women, they had bigger dreams, and you can almost imagine them sitting at home in the evening, as children, and their big brother had just gone off on some Viking expedition to the east, to Asia, and come back with all kinds of trading goods, exotic goods from Asia. And you can almost see the younger sister thinking, geez, that sounds really exciting. A lot more exciting than staying home on the farm here in Scandinavia and milking cows. I would like to go and try that myself, So you can, yes, we are, we stand in time a long distance away from these people. As I say, the Viking Age start to wind down in the late 1000s. So, yes, we're a long ways away from them, but still, I don't think it's a big jump to say that not all Viking women want to submit and play traditional roles.
In the center of the book, there's a collection of photographs with artifacts relating to women specifically from the Viking culture. Can you tell us a little bit about what readers will find there?
Well, we see a number of things here. We see, for example, some of the very elaborate jewelry that Viking women wore. This was jewelry that was worn by the upper classes of society, females from the upper classes of society. And we have to remind ourselves, of course, that the Vikings came from a very kind of hierarchical society. And so there were very wealthy upper class women and also very poor women. And we don't, unfortunately, know a lot about the poor women because their burials are not particularly rich. So we know a lot more about the upper class women and how they dressed and the jewelry they wore. We can see from some of the photos, there are several photos of the treasures that were found in the Oseberg ship. We see, for example, some of the carved animal. There's an example of one of the carved animal heads. Just incredible woodworking skills. And that carved animal head may have been used as part of ceremonial rites that were conducted by one of the women that was buried in the Oseberg ship. There is evidence now that the Oseberg women, at least one of them, may have been a sorceress, and probably a pretty powerful one at that. And the reason why we say that is that archaeologists have gone through the saga accounts that I was mentioning earlier and have noted down all the equipment and tools that sorceresses used in their magical rituals and so on. So there's kind of it was a major piece of research going through hundreds and hundreds of burial records of what was found in the graves of upper class Viking women, because sorceresses usually they were upper class women. So what did they wear? What kinds of tools did they carry? One of the big tools, interestingly enough, is a staff. and you might think of a magical wand almost. And these staffs could be either made of metal or they could be made of very, very finely polished wood. And the ones that were made of very, very finely polished wood were used by very senior sorceresses, it seems, according to the sagas. And these wooden staffs were used to tame human wills and break human will. And so it was a really powerful tool of sorcery. And interestingly enough, in the burial in the Oseberg ship burial that I mentioned at the beginning, archaeologists found one of these wooden staffs in there. Archaeologists also found a leather pouch with what appeared to be magical, with magical amulets would have fit into very neatly. Another thing that that sorceresses carried with them. They also found seeds of cannabis in the ship, in the burial, in the bed where the women were laid out, it appears. And so these cannabis seeds, of course, contain THC, which is a mind-altering drug. And it may have been used to assist a sorceress in entering a trance state for her rituals. So, in the Oseberg ship, we do see evidence of sorcery, and the tapestries that I mentioned earlier also show scenes in which sorceresses seem to be conducting rituals. So there is evidence in the Oseberg ship that these women, at least one of them, was a sorceress, and as I say, a very powerful one. In the book, we also have illustrations, unfortunately, of slave shackles, that women who were enslaved, captive women that the Vikings trafficked, let's say, from, parts of Europe to certainly to Scandinavia and perhaps further on in the East. So there are shackles in the photos and, various kinds of jewelry, and also photos of Lancel Meadows, which is the site that archaeologists have excavated in Newfoundland, which is a Viking site. So it is actually a Viking base camp. And there have been, archaeologists have thoroughly excavated Lancel Meadows, and they have found evidence of women there. And so this site dates to 1021, has been dated really carefully to around 1021. And so that's more than 50, 70 years before Columbus, 472 years before Columbus. And there were women at that site. There are objects very closely associated with women at that site. And it's evidence that women were part of these very, very early expeditions to the New World. And in fact, we do have evidence in some of the sagas that supports that contention as well. So again, there is, I think, archaeology is very, very important in helping us fill in the gaps about what some women were doing during this time. And when we look at archaeology in concert with the sagas, we start getting a pretty interesting picture.
Well, this is all really fascinating. It's given us a new perspective on the Vikings, which I'm sure is exciting to historians and other academics. But why should the average person today in today's society be excited about these discoveries?
Well, I think it's really important because I think if we really want to understand the Vikings, and clearly a lot of us do want to understand the Vikings because they capture our imagination, but if we want to understand who they are, and we want to get a clear picture of the Viking world, we need to be able to have a clear picture of both the men and the women. You need that. You need to have both of them there because otherwise you're missing 50% of the story. So I think it's really important, in terms of just our understanding of the Viking Age. But more than that, I think it's really important for young women and girls today growing up to know that strong women were always present in societies in the past. They were certainly present, in the Viking Age. And even though we have this image of a world steeped in testosterone, it wasn't such a male-dominated place that there were, that women couldn't find important roles to play in it. So I think that it is important, and we need these women as role models, but we also need them just to complete our ideas about the Viking Age.
Well, Vikings have captured the imagination of people for a long time. In fact, we have television shows that feature the Vikings. Do you hope that this new information will maybe inform how those are presented in the future?
Yes, I really do hope so. At the moment, we see a lot of Viking movies that focus on certainly male Viking warriors, male Viking commanders, and also male Viking gods. There were, we do now have evidence of female warriors, and we do have, we certainly have, we certainly from the sagas know about female gods, and some of these female divinities, in the Viking world, in the Viking mind. And some of these female divinities, were very powerful too. Freya, who was a goddess of prosperity, fertility, the battlefield, sorcery, and magic. And, these were very important people, or very important divinities in the Viking world. Why not a movie about one of these divinities and, a female commander, a female military commander, and maybe female warriors? Why not? I think it would be really interesting, and it would be a big, kind of a big change to the standard Hollywood formula about Vikings, which is, in my mind, getting a wee bit stale. So,
the book is The Northwomen: Untold Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World by Heather Pringle. Heather, thank you for talking with me today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
If you'd like to purchase The Northwomen, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more interviews you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.